We can start, sir. Yeah.
Just 1 minute. One more. So, Lakshmi sir,
Ravi, you can start.
you can start. Okay, sir. Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everyone. So welcome to the part 3 lecture series. Today topic is Dalits and Occupational Mobility in Tamil Nadu, findings from the census. Today our speaker is Professor Tagu Ranganathan sir. I will give a brief introduction about Ranganathan sir. Thiago Ranganathan sir is a professor at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala. Since his PhD at IIT Bombay, he has worked on issues in agriculture economics and development economics, including agriculture price risk management, implications of water scarcity on rural livelihood, diversification, institutional barriers to employment of highly educated women, and the implications of monetary incentives of forest restoration. His work spans across the themes of risk, vulnerability, resilience, livelihood, diversification, and social mobility. So his specialization in agricultural economics and development economics. So he's teaching in CDS in Kerala. So I would like to give lecture Professor Thagu Ranganathan sir. Please welcome and once again thank you sir. Please give a lecture.
Thank you, Ravi sir, and thank you, Malepalli sir, for inviting me to this lecture. Yeah, again, like as you mentioned, you are also part of CDS, and I come from this different CDS. So today what I will do is present some of the findings related to Dalits and occupational mobility. From focusing on one state, Tamil Nadu, I'll also kind of tell why Tamil Nadu has some kind of interesting background to analyze this particular question. Um, so uh, maybe um, I take about 25 to 40 minutes, hopefully within that, and then I'll present some of the basic findings from the census. This idea is also about, there is this whole thing about caste census coming up, and there is this certain feeling that before this caste census, there is no data related to caste and education and occupation, which is not true. There is some data, and I think um, hopefully what I present here will help understand what is it we can learn from this data. And also as the new data comes in, maybe this acts as a baseline to understanding changes in the society. So broadly, again, this is because it is about Samvidhan. So I will also try to relate how occupational mobility, the way here mobility, I do not mean movement from one place to another. Here, when I say mobility, I am referring to movement across status. Like in terms of social mobility, when we say, we talk about mobility across status. So from different status, how do people move across these status? And how constitution in some indirect manner has touched upon this aspect related to mobility. This is something I've been reflecting, but I have not thought through all through in a final way. But I think it's important to relate to that given the context of this series. Then I'll give some background of few studies that have been conducted with regard to social mobility. And also then I'll talk about what is it about Tamil Nadu that makes this study critical. And I'll present some of the research questions that I'm addressing in this particular presentation and findings from them. Broadly, if you were to think of how does Constitution this occupation mobility, in some ways, Constitution provides this thing. People should be able to uh, make their way to occupations they prefer. And as we know, if that is somewhat easier in any country, any society, with India, where caste is not just division of labor, I think it's very difficult for people to pursue the occupation they prefer, and that is one of the rigidity that caste system imposes on Indian society. Given that is the crux of the society.
Maybe last hours.
I think the internet is a bit weak here, so sorry for
So you
that.
can, you can off your video, sir. You can off your video.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Then it will.
Mhm. Yeah. Right. So some of the indirect ways in which Constitution touches upon this freedom to pursue any occupation is that so Article 19(1) it provides the right to participate in any profession, occupation, trade, or business, and citizens have the freedom to choose and engage in their preferred livelihoods. And Article 60 prohibits discrimination in matters of public employment based on caste, religion, or any other factor. Though it employment, in general, any occupation, there should be no discrimination based on caste, religion, or any other factor, which should mean that as the economy transforms and people kind of pursue various occupations, that should not differ based on the caste that the person belongs to. And Article 41 also states that the state shall, within the limits of its economic capacity and development, make effective provision for securing the right to work and to education. Again, so in some sense, when if these things don't happen automatically, then the state is supposed to work towards effective provisioning towards education, and then with education, if people want to pursue certain kind of occupations, then state has to intervene in it. So in some ways, Constitution has laid framework for movement across occupation for individuals. And if at all this the Indian society, which is primarily a caste society, has to transform to a democratic society, then we should see people belonging to various castes having similar share in varied occupations. And that is that happening is the question that I wish to pursue in this presentation. So if you look at varied, before we even talk about what is happening to the specific case of Tamil Nadu, there are certain economic realities that we have to take into account as we kind of think about Dalits mobility. So, and one of the things that has happened in the Indian economy is that there was this whole gaga about India's economic growth for 30, 35 years. And in between some 10, 15 years, there was this whole thing about tremendous growth and things like that. But what was kind of perplexing during that time was that despite that high growth, there was generally no big changes to the job. There was this jobless growth for some time. And for certain period, it was actually job loss with growth. So in that sense, this all this talk about growth in India was not happening in a way where a typical economic growth happens in various economies. And the other thing that kept on pursuing, which was not paradoxical, but to people who understand Indian society. But it is that this informal institution, the modernization hypothesis, was supposed to say that as kind of things change, then caste and things like gender would start to matter lesser and lesser. That modernization hypothesis, which was kind of some kind of invisible hand for the social realities, did not happen. And actually, we see more things, some kind of egalitarian paradox where castes seem to be closely linked to socioeconomic status, even in states where they indicate high social indicators, the development indicators, but larger socioeconomic outcomes and status were seemingly correlated with caste. So these realities have addressed attention, and more than economists, sociologists and historians have kept on focusing on these realities and have been asking economists to pay attention to this particular aspect. Some of the kind of broader studies that have focused are on mobility as such, and change of status has been like this study by Osella and Osella, which have looked at Iravas, how they have mobilized, how their mobility has changed over time. And the classic would be Hardgrave, which talks about Nadar's mobility. And Jaffrelot calls OBCs as a group having gone through silent revolution. So these are like things which look at, these are studies which look at jatis and how they have, how specific jatis have pursued social mobility and how they have achieved, they face challenges, but they also achieved success in moving up in certain instances. The economists have, when they have come to study this, they have largely spoken not at the jati level, they speak of individual level and caste as one general attribute of an individual. And there is varied studies that seem to be happening now from the economy, but they don't look at jati level analysis, which is how people face realities on the ground in the villages, but primarily, and that is not coming across in these studies. So what I try to do, and there have been varied data sources that have been used, and one of the things that is limiting in all these data sources that I'm presenting is the lack of jati level analysis. I think 1931, the government decided not to collect jati level data, but for whatever strange reasons, many of the academics and many of the data collection sources also stopped, particularly those with economic bent, also stopped collecting jati level data much. Recently, there is some changes, but that has happened. So to understand jati level information, there are very few data sources, and population census is a kind of data source. And what I want to present today is primarily from the population census data. And so what is it that Tamil Nadu is so interesting, or Tamil Nadu, why Tamil Nadu might be more interesting to study is that one of the things with Tamil Nadu, like previously I said that people have not moved out of agriculture, even with high economic growth. But Tamil Nadu is always framed as a place where it has become post-agrarian. Few people suggest that people have moved out of agriculture, and agriculture doesn't matter to the state, and it has become post-agrarian. I will reflect on this claim much more later. Not so paradoxical in this state, and maybe modernization hypothesis may be more relevant to this, or more applicable and more say prominent in this state. That is one possibility. And there is a long history of anti-caste movements in Tamil Nadu. It begins with Ayodhya Das, and there have been many Dalit pioneers of anti-caste struggles. Then the non-Brahmin movement, which appropriated some of the ideas, and they also started something called a Justice Party, and the Dravidian movement, which kind of basically moved away from all the ideals of the Dalit pioneers, and they just focused on welfareism. So this is kind of, there has been a transition of social movements also, but there has been some robust social movements across time in this state. And other thing that has been consistent in this state for long has been this history of affirmative action, which starts with reservations for non-Brahmins since 1921. And apart from this, there have been political parties which have been asserting caste, and there has been decades of politics of caste patronage, particularly to intermediate caste by Dravidian parties. So all of this means that uh, this is kind of, I think, as my friend Jayasilan says, this state has many anti-caste castes, and that kind of also probably is something which the data might reflect. The other thing is that so many things that happen in this state have been like with the rhetoric of social justice, and but things have not seemingly improved much, and that has been pointed out by many scholars, and so that makes it very important to study this state, and because this hollow claims of social justice makes it difficult to understand what is happening in the field, and there is a huge scholarship which kind of almost moves on the verge of propaganda, suggesting this state is a epitome of social justice, which makes it very difficult to understand what is happening. The other political things are Dalit assertion has been pronounced at least since 1990s. There have been varied trajectories of Dalit assertion and mobilization across different jatis within SCs. So we would anticipate different mobility possibilities for these different jatis. And one other thing that has happened in this state is also among the earliest state to subclassify OBCs and Dalits. So OBCs were subclassified into backward classes and most backward classes, and scheduled castes were also subclassified into scheduled caste A and scheduled caste. So what have these done to mobility is another important thing in context of Tamil Nadu. So given this overall background about importance of mobility and the specific case of mobility to Tamil Nadu, I asked these two questions, like what is the extent of mobility of SCs compared to non-SCs in Tamil Nadu? So here I look at changes in mobility over from 1991 to 2011 between SCs and non-SCs. The second thing, and also on occupation, the second thing I do is what is the extent of education and occupational dissimilarity within jatis belonging to SCs. So when we say SCs, there are 76 jatis which form this scheduled caste in Tamil Nadu. So not all of them are similar, and they do face various levels of discrimination from the non-SCs in their particular regions. And they are like, some of the larger groups are very geographically concentrated separately. So what has been happening to these different jatis within SCs is another question that I focus on. So for answering this question, I particularly use the population census data from 1991 and 2011. We did the analysis for 2001 too, but I'm only presenting 91 and 2011. And I present this dissimilarity indices. So in some ways, if at all freedom to pursue occupation, any occupation where to reflect on the ground, we should see very little differences across shares of people in different occupation between SCs and non-SCs, and also and across any caste. That is what we should anticipate to see. So this is first thing I'm focusing is on SCs and non-SCs in education as of 1991. So what I've presented here is the proportion of people in with different levels of education. So if we see in 1991, after 44 years of independence, what we see is that there were like illiterates form like 61% of SCs were illiterate, and whereas with non-SCs, it was only 42%. And then as we move to other categories, all other categories, SCs are underrepresented and non-SCs are overrepresented. So if you look at above primary but to matriculation and secondary, there are only 10.9% of SCs who were in that particular education category, but it was 19% for non-SCs. And if you look at graduate degree and above, it was only 0.8% for SCs, whereas it is 3.1% for non-SCs. So with this, what we can do is calculate some kind of index of similarity. I'm not delving into how this is calculated, but the broad idea is how we interpret that is that so this 18.4% of a particular group have to be redistributed to make them look similar to the other group. So for instance, in this case, where it's somewhat simpler to see is that if 18% of illiterate in SCs were to be distributed across all other levels, then they both will be similar. So in that sense, the higher the index of dissimilarity, that would mean that there is a lot of difference between the two groups. And in 1991, even after 44 years of independence, we see about 18% is the dissimilar. That is, out of every 100 people in SC, 18 have to be taken and redistributed across categories to make them similar to non-SCs. And there is also heterogeneities within non-SCs, which the census data has not covered yet, but the new census data is likely to throw us some light on that. So if this was 1991, what happens 20 years later? And when we see 20 years later, what we see is that there is a drastic reduction in illiterates across SCs and non-SCs, and there is also increase in all other categories, including graduates, but across other categories there is a tremendous increase. But this difference between SCs and non-SCs seems to persist. But what we see is that the rate of improvement among SCs has been much faster than non-SCs. So in that sense, the difference in illiterate, which was about 18% for SCs and non-SCs in 1991, has come down to about 8% now. And then, so in some ways, the index of dissimilarity has come down from 8 to 9. This indicates that SCs have taken up to education and they have grown in education much faster than non-SCs, and the gap between SCs and non-SCs at this level of broad education level achievements seems to be narrowing. That is something which we do find on the field, but it's good to know that census, which tells about this 7 crore people, seems to indicate something similar. Now let's look at what is happening within SC. So within SC as I mentioned, there are 76 cities, and SCs particularly as of 1991, 1 crore, the population of 5.5 crores was SC, so around 19.2% of the total population. And 76 jatis have varied population. So the smallest group was called Ranayar, which had only 59 individuals, whereas the largest group, Adi Dravida, which had like 52,39,405 individuals. So now again, to look at all the 76 categories would be not so enlightening. I think we can still group them into certain similar categories. And what we find is that out of the 17 jatis, 18 jatis form 3 broad categories. And these 18 jatis constitute 97.7% of the SC population. So Adi Dravidas, if we see Adi Dravidas, then there are Parayan, Sambavar, then there is Valluvan, Puravan. All of these groups, sometimes they identify by their jati name or they identify themselves as Adi Dravida. So it is important to not categorize them separately. So if you take Adi Dravidas as a group comprising of these jatis, then they form about 63% of SCs in 1990. Then we have Pallan, Devendra Kulathan, Pannadi, Kadayan, Kaladi, Kudumban, Vathirian. So they have claimed that they want to be claimed a Devendra Kula Velalar, and they are primarily more concentrated on South Tamil Nadu, and they form about 18.8% of the scheduled caste. And then Arundadiyars, who form Chakkaliyan, Arundadiyar, Madari, Adi Andhra, Pagadai, Totti, Madiga. These are the jatis which the state has categorized them as Arundadiyars or SCA, and they form about 16% of SCs. Again, they are more concentrated in the western part of Tamil Nadu. And so it is like north, south, west, and they have to engage with different other backward classes and different kind of domination from these backward classes. And then the political mobilization of these backward classes and the Dalits, these specific Dalit groups in these regions have implications on how they move ahead in occupation. So rather than focusing on all the groups, what I'm trying to do is now look at only three broad groups and look at how they fare across education. Then if we look at these groups, what we find is that in 1991, as you remember, I think some 1991, there were about 60% of Dalits who were illiterate, but only 42% of non-SCs who were illiterate. And what we see within SCs and non-SCs is that there is slight differences that Arundhadiyars have about 71% of Arundhadiyars are illiterate compared to say 59% of Devendras and Adi Dravidas. And but then all of it is much more than the non-SCs who only 42% are illiterate. And again, we see that differences. And we do so if we calculate this dissimilarity between the three broad groups, and then what we find is that the Arundhadiyar Devendra dissimilarity is about 12, Arundhadiyar Adi Dravidar dissimilarity is about 12.3, but Devendra Adi Dravidar, they seem to be almost very similar in educational achievements. So about 1.7%, which you may not consider it as very dissimilar at all. So this is what we find the situation in 1991. So over this next 20-year period, what happened within these groups? So what over time, things did change. And as I mentioned previously, that the difference between SCs and non-SCs in terms of educational achievements had changed drastically. What we find once we put within the categories is that the educational achievements and attainment and education seeking of Devendras and Adi Dravidas has been so tremendous that they seem to be doing better than the non-SCs in many categories, except when it comes to post-12th standard and graduate and postgraduate. That is where, particularly graduates, there is some shortfall than non-SCs, but we see tremendous rise in education among Devendras and Adi Dravidas. Whereas the Arundhadiyars have not seen such an increase in their educational achievements as of 2011 census. And we see that the dissimilarities between Arundhadiyar Adi Dravidar and Arundhadiyar Devendra seem to persist over this 20-year period. But importantly, mainly the degree is where the non-SCs seem to be doing slightly better. But there is some kind of, we could say, some kind of silent educational revolution happening in Tamil Nadu, particularly with Dalits in terms of at least obtaining education. There is this level of achievement. I have not checked for all India. It's very unlikely that many states would have seen such achievements in education. So this is like, so what we would anticipate, what we have seen so far is that education-wise, there was a slightly higher gap in 1991, which had reduced in 2011. So obviously, if things were to operate in a way, we should see something similar when it came to occupation. So what we should see is that the occupational dissimilarities between SCs and non-SCs should come down over this 20-year period. And this is where what we find, one is that, so let me show the occupational something similar dissimilarities, but some of the data points for 1991, I have to put all of those physical hard copies into Excel. For now, I'm showing broad categories for 1991 and 2011. We'll see broad movements so that we can get some idea. So what we find in 1990 is, if we look at, so broadly putting all other occupations into one, because the 1991 census does not have different details of it, we can classify all workers into cultivators, agricultural laborers, and other occupations. And once we do that, what we find is that out of the workers, there are only 15% of SCs who were cultivators, whereas it was 28% for non-SCs. And there were 21% in SCs who were engaged in other occupations, which was 46% in non-SCs. And most importantly, 64% of SCs, 44 years um, after independence and the so-called post-agrarian revolution, 64% of the SCs were still engaged in agricultural labor as agricultural laborers, whereas non-SCs it was only 26%. So if we calculate this dissimilarity is much wider than the educational dissimilarity. So what we find is about 38% is the index of dissimilarity. That is, 38% of the Dalits have to be replaced across categories to make them similar to non-SCs. And this level of dissimilarity is hardly found in any country with for a certain group to be so highly stratified across occupation. Now, we did see that compared to 1991, 2011 education, there has been a narrowing. So what has happened to occupation, if you look at it? So again, now 2011 census has much more detailed data. So what we have is not just cultivators and agricultural laborers and other occupation. For all these other occupations, we have share of people doing specific occupations like legislators, professionals, technicians, clerks, service and market sales workers, skilled agriculture and fishery workers, craft and related trade workers, plant and machine operators and assemblers, and elementary occupations. Again, these are further classified into other categories. I have not gone into all the details. At this level, one digit level of classification, as they call it, once we do this classification, what we find is that despite all that occupational mobility, educational mobility, what we see is that one is only 25% are agricultural laborers, whereas when it comes to SC workers, 53% as of 2011 census are still agricultural laborers. And the next highest engagement for SCs comes in elementary occupation. So if we take these two broad categories, which in terms of status would be kind of among the lower run, we see that about 65, 66 percentage are still in agriculture elementary occupation. And this for the non-SCs, because in some sense we are understanding relative mobility. We are not doing this without understanding of the economy. The economy which has made only 35% of non-SCs into this occupation is keeping 66% of SCs still in these two basic operations. So the index of dissimilarity is still 30% and it is not coming down. It has not come down drastically. The educational dissimilarity had come down by half from a very small base. The occupational dissimilarity seems to persist at very high rates. And this is the primary concern that I try to raise with this analysis. And again, another thing about these distinctions within SCs, here again what we see is that when we look at within SCs, the three groups, Arundhadiyar, Devendra, Adi Dravid, what we find is that there is in 1991, there is, despite there were these disparities in education, the disparities in occupation are not there much. Like, so if you look at the disparities seem to be coming from the fact that only 5% of Arundhadiyars are cultivators, and this might be largely related to how land was possessed by these three different jatis, and that implying a much higher proportion of agricultural laborers. When it came to occupations other than cultivators and agricultural laborers, we see almost similar proportion being involved in other occupations. So despite differences in education, the occupation profile of a SC does not seem to change based on the jati they belong to. Whatever changes are there, there seems to be, particularly the cultivator thing, has to probably got to do with linkages with land. And so but land would make a big difference in the longer run. So, but if at all the land is somewhat substantial. So let's see what happens in 2011. 2011, again now we are getting into the detailed distribution of various occupations. And what we find here is that despite all this fact that there was this, what I can tentatively call it a silent educational revolution, occupations seem to be very stagnant for Dalits. So, so when it came again with all that education, we still see about 64% of Adi Dravidas are engaged only in as agri laborers and elementary occupations. And same Devendra, it is coming to around 64%. Though Arundhadiyas, they seem to be much more engaged in these two occupations. There is 56%. But all of these three jatis within SCs seem to be much more represented or much more occupied in these occupations, whereas the non-SCs, only 35% are in the as working as agri laborers or elementary occupation. So what we see is that the dissimilarities within jatis when it comes to occupation seems to be very narrow, and this is the contestation around subcategorization and anxieties around subcategorization seem to be emerging from this occupational immobility aspect of what is happening to all the Dalits despite their improvements in education. So broadly, I say between what I have done is that looking at SCs and non-SCs and within jatis or subcategories in the SCs, what we find is that with education, narrowing gap between SCs and non-SCs, and not just narrowing gap, there is a lot more graduates, and I think if at all the trend would have to continue, we are going to see much more graduates in SCs than non-SCs, which is on various different parts of the field, we do hear that. Then, but the gap between Arundhadiyas and others are there, and it is reducing only gradually. And I think the 2009, the subcategorization for Arundhadiyas began. So 2022, this census, whenever it comes, might provide us some idea on has there been reduction in this educational dissimilarity. But particularly when it comes to occupation, the state still remains as a where caste plays a critical role of division of laborers, and where we see huge discrepancy. Caste in particular, being an SC means a particular kind of occupation compared to being a non-SC. The post-agrarian Tamil Nadu is only post-agrarian for the non-Dalit. So the changes in education have not narrowed the occupational discrepancies. Still, an index of dissimilarity of 30.3%. This index calculated across countries, this is a very high number. These gaps primarily due to over-representation of Dalits as agriculture and elementary occupation, and under-representation as cultivators, even service workers and trade workers, we see significant under-representation in Dalits. And when it comes to occupation within jatis of SCs, here again, there is less dissimilarities, and primarily from cultivators and agricultural labor is where the distinction for Arundhadiyar seem to be coming from. But this, again, as I mentioned before, this may be got to do something with linkages to land redistribution, whatever minimal happened during the history. So I would just tentatively put that. I'm not claiming that to be the sure reason. So at the level of SCs as a whole, there is high mobility in education, but more disparities with non-SCs in occupation. This is difficulties in translating educational improvements to occupational or economic mobility. And this is like something which matters. Like it is what is the final status in society is typically defined by occupations. And if despite all these high achievements in education, people have to end up doing element, and this is a relative mobility. So we are not saying Dalits are finding it difficult, but it is Dalits are finding it difficult even relative to, in relation to non-SCs in translating their educational improvements to occupational mobility. So again, so this is where I said the anxieties around subcategorization, where Arundhadiyars seem to be claiming their educational backwardness, and but they are also Arundhadiyar or the people who are fighting for Arundhadiyar reservation seem to be telling these differences, but also which have to be acknowledged, but also it is that the occupation has not changed within SCs, and that is where there is some kind of discontent among the other jatis within SC. So, but this is only census and it can tell us only this broad level. We need to entangle the processes underlying this occupational immobility, and there could be, in many ways, caste plays a role in coming up with these outcomes. People can call it aspirational, short forms, social networks. Again, we know only degrees. We don't know the type of degrees. We don't know the access of quality education institutes. Again, capital constraints, we don't know. And there is this thing about skill that is being put. And there is, obviously, there is a large extent of discrimination, particularly in the informal sector. And that is going to play a role in sustaining this occupational immobility. And I think so. This census data is to just set up the overall overview, give an overview of what is happening, and then obviously you need field level studies to entangle why this is happening. And state also has to engage, apart from just talking about affirmative action in government sector. It has to also make sure that this occupational movement for people to pursue whatever livelihoods they want, irrespective of their caste, that state has to enable such a movement. Yeah, obviously we know Tamil Nadu state is not the one that is likely to do anything. We anticipate something on that regard. And there are few other states that have worked actively, and this Malaypalli sir I came across because he had mentioned about Dalit Bandhu scheme. So where such schemes which also enable Dalits to get into varied occupations. It is not only affirmative action in government sector that matters. Those also matter and those are critical. But any mobility from elementary occupation and agricultural labor has to be free, and that is the in some ways a constitutional safeguard and right. And I think we need to focus on that too. And this thing about talk about post-agrarian Tamil Nadu seems to be very problematic, because that is ignoring this 20% of population who have not been able to say move out of agriculture nor have proper land in agriculture to have some kind of profitable agriculture. And then despite education, these are happening, is something that tells us more about the state. And this all the claims of educational achievements would not be so important if it is not going to translate into social mobility. And that is something the state has to acknowledge first and act accordingly. Yeah. Yeah, these are my observations based on the census data. And yeah, I would be happy to answer your questions, comments, criticisms. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Great lecture and all data in Tamil Nadu. Lakshmaya sir is there. So
Okay,
now,
please open for the discussion.
yes,
And then
is forum open for the discussion. Any questions, please introduce yourself and you can ask questions briefly. Thank you.
Yeah, Shalin is written something. So do you have data on how the discrimination and violence change based on mobility? Yeah, this is so this is something, this data, actually census doesn't have any data, but this is there is all these discussions around this about how this educational mobility is seen in a very antagonistic manner, because the state has this general attitude of a kind of Dalit hatred is so imbibed in the state. So sometimes basic educational mobility also causes causes lot of discomfort uh, for the for the dominant caste in that particular region. So, and again, some people claim that these regions where there is not much education mobility, there is less violence. I don't know what they imply by that. So, do they want people to be less mobile so that there is no violence, or do they want state to take strict action so that there is a if there is a any kind of violence against Dalits? And as we see occupationally, all this hatred, part of it is also reflected in the kind of occupation. Even in certain occupations, which for with basic education, people should be able to get into it. There seems to be some kind of disparities that is reducing, but this persistence of these disparities does indicate some level of discrimination. So this decomposing what is what in a caste society is very problematic, because this is like social network. Again, it is, if it is based on caste and things like that, then things become very difficult. But the fact that there is such high dissimilarities even after so many years and even after so much has been achieved in education is an area of concern. And that is where Tamil Nadu and Kerala become the egalitarian paradox, as my friend calls it, Jayasilan. It is not like, so some indicators seem to be good, then people tend to think that things are all fine in this state. But even if you look at certain other indicators, we see drastic changes or differences between Dalits and non-Dalits. So yeah, but the question of data, I don't have, but I think that is something we need to have to highlight what is happening with the violence, because there is a lot of anecdotal and news-based things. There is no hard data I have come across.
Ranganathan garu, another question is there. Could you share more about your
Yes, sir.
observation from the field where your field works?
And yeah, this is something that I did as a part of this field project, which I've started in northern Tamil Nadu, and so I'm working on few villages there, and what I've been trying to do is look at intergenerational mobility, like where I want to look at across three generations, what has been the education and the occupation level. And when we go to the field, we get more details on how do they navigate this lack of occupational movement despite education. So what I find is people doing writing lot of these exams. Government exam seems to be one of the key aspiration because of so much untold told violence that happens in getting into other kind of jobs. So government jobs seems to be the key aspiration, but there too there is this movement to predominantly this group 4 kind of exams, and these group 4 exams are there as a big thing in the field. People keep writing these group 4 exams. One of the things with group 4 level exams is also there is no age limit. I think changed it recently, but for a lot of time there was no age limit. So because when so people their youth keep trying, the newer generation seem to be trying for these. So we have collected some data. I have to enter it and process it and present something on that too. So this was like preliminary based on census, but I will probably present more on the field-based findings. And yeah, that so we understand more the processes behind this immobility. So what is it people do when they don't get the job that according to their education? Some of them just keep doing more and more graduate degrees, this B.Ed, M.Ed, then another MSc, another B.Ed, and in relation to other castes, too, this is very problematic. It's not to say that only Dalits face these issues, but even in relation to other castes, Dalits seem to be going through these issues much longer. And because there is no land, they also end up becoming casual laborers, which is not necessarily the case when people have some kind of land. So that is these are few broad observations, but I have to put in the data and collect it. So this is in Krishnagiri district. This is where I'm looking at 4 villages there. So And yeah, please close the PPT. Okay.
Hello.
Is there to have any questions?
Uh,
Otherwise, we can close.
Sir, please, sir.
Daroj sir was saying, yeah.
Hello. Jai Bhim to participants. And here I'm engineer M.R. Dhruv from Himachal Pradesh. And
Yes, sir.
Professor sir, you spoke about mainly on education and this data based on census. And my question is, what you said now, the land, about land. And what is the status of land distribution among the SCs and non-SCs in Tamil Nadu? As far as my knowledge is concerned, Tamil Nadu is dominated by the OBC community. If am I right, then what is the status of OBCs? Are they SCs or non-SCs? If are they SCs, what is the attitude of OBCs towards SCs? And what is the population of non-SCs in Tamil Nadu? And a little question is there. Why the government didn't want to jati level census data? What is behind? Where development schemes are based on caste census to the marginalized communities to bring them to mainstream. For example, Dalit Bandhu, this scheme in Telangana. So this is my, these are my observations and questions, sir. And over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think there are many questions, but maybe I think what you asked is a bit linked. One is that this dominance of OBCs, and then the thing about why caste census is being resisted. And I think these are very linked in Tamil Nadu, in case of Tamil Nadu. One is that the state has had when we say the everywhere OBC is a very heterogeneous group of castes, jatis, but in Tamil Nadu it is lot of the backward castes are the dominant castes in their region, and they have been they have been getting government patronage for much longer than any other state. So there is this lot of schemes and lot of affirmative action has been given by the state and have been appropriated by the dominant backward classes, and a lot of dominant classes are castes are in the backward class list. There is a certain backward classes, they're subcategorized, even they have received patronage for a shorter time, but all political mobilization, all of it has been around this caste. So one of the things that the state doesn't, Tamil Nadu, despite giving this rhetoric of social justice, has not told anything about caste census. And that is because they don't want to show the privilege and the achievements of the dominant caste within the backward caste. So I think both of your things are linked. And again, we'll have to I can't tell like this is what is happening all through the state, but we can reasonably tell because all of the mobilization in Tamil Nadu is based on caste, and the backward caste predominantly appropriated many things through affirmative action for themselves and also schemes uh, to them. So whatever welfare schemes has been there for Dalits, something similar has been always given for backward classes as some kind of scheme. So that has been there, and that is the process through which these disparities seem to persist. Shaleen has asked, is it possible to get data on how SCs and non are fared in government jobs in terms of career mobility? This cannot be done with census data, but there is a this CMI has some data on which was collected in 2000 from 2014 to 23. So there some analysis I have done. I will share that later, but it is not census. It is a sample. So there are going to be biases with the way sample is done. Arun has a question. How far does the fluidity in employment across spaces with the high informality is captured in this data? And do you think it changes our conclusion anyway? Also, if it does not change, do you think that the anti-Dalitism has intensified under neoliberalism? So the first thing of across spaces, yeah, one simple check which we could do is proportion of dissimilarities in rural and urban share across jatis, and maybe one that can tell some indicator about how much of it is because lack of mobility, not the social mobility into urban spaces. But it doesn't change the conclusion, even if it were to be, and I don't think we will see more SEs in urban areas or something like that. In effect, it is the occupation that matters, and that way I doubt it will, even if there is this rural-urban divide, it changes the conclusion in any particular way, because see, as long as if at all it is that the overall occupation structure is changing, then we could say we could look into why it is changing, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The thing about anti-Dalit discrimination has intensified under neoliberalism. That I don't think I am competent to comment, but I don't think. Um, yeah, I think it has intensified under neoliberalism. Don't know. There is, in terms of welfare schemes and all, I know what we mean by neoliberalism is again such a Pandora's box. So one thing is that if say neoliberalism means kind of moving of state away, I think that has happened lesser in Tamil Nadu. That is another thing that they keep harping about in the Dravidian model, that there is this state is still being playing an active role as a welfare state and all that. So then if that were to be the case, then I don't know whether it is because of that neoliberalism has not changed this welfare state model in this state. So, but if there are other aspects to neoliberalism, if there is any specific thing you have, then I could discuss. But if we take this role, that has not actually reduced in the neoliberal
If I may,
so-called neo. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I did not mean it from the sense of state and state withdrawal in that sense. But in Tamil Nadu, like people do talk about how this provincial capital has been very much in nexus with the neoliberal capital in the whole neoliberal phase and its capitalist development. So in that sense, like your intermediate caste has been like the main beneficiaries, particularly when it comes to intermediate caste elites, right? So has this in some sense like excluded Dalits from this whole, uh, to in some sense like move towards urban spaces, like, the very fluid mobility between rural and urban space, which people keep talking about. So that is where I'm coming from.
Even in 1991, when I shot the operation, we see that about 65% of Dalits were in agri laborers and 15% cultivators, meaning about 80% were in some kind of basic agriculture, agri labor and basic agriculture. This was right, and that was for the non-SCs, it was 50%, 54. Huh? So this difference of lack of representation in any kind of capital based, apart from cultivation, which again, cultivator only census captures, we don't know what is, and we don't expect Dalits to be having some capital intensive agriculture much. I think we can go, if that assumption were to be there, then even before neoliberalism, this was not so very different in terms of access to capital and things like that. So yeah, that is like, so whether it has worsened is a tough question to say. Yeah, that is like, this difference was so stark in 1991. So then this is like remaining so high. So I don't know whether it is, we can say with this data that it has intensified or anything like that.
Right. Is any questions? So nobody there, we will close this today's lecture.
No, thank you, Ranganathanji. I think you did well. You uh, mm, you reference from the Constitution and all the details. See, I think it should be one model for study for other states also. I think it will
Yes.
use for the activities our friends attended today. I think thank you very much. Thank you to all. Thank
Okay,
you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, if there is anything, I will also send my email ID just in case if anybody wants to email for the presentation or any
Please
questions.
write down here. It is better to they will capture today
Yeah.
itself. Na?
Okay, sir. Yeah, I've sent it, sir. Huh? So yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
And thank you for inviting me, sir. Yeah, and yeah, sorry for delaying like 1 or 2 weeks. But
No
yeah,
problem, no
hopefully
problem.
this.
It's a good. Otherwise, you will also have a prepare. Na? That's a.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you, sir. Huh? Thank you so
Thank
much for those who attended. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody. We will meet next on Saturday. Thank you.